What counts as harassment and stalking? I'm Barrister Daniel Barnett, and I'm going to be explaining to you what the criminal definitions of harassment and stalking are. This is different from the colloquial definitions. It's different from the definition of harassment in employment law and some other areas of law. We are dealing specifically with the criminal law surrounding the offences of harassment and stalking. The words harassment and stalking are often used by people to describe what colloquially is known as creepy or slightly disturbing behaviour. But the criminal law has a very precise definition of both harassment and stalking. The definitions are slightly less straightforward than what we understand in ordinary conversation. So when could something that somebody might call harassment turn into something that you could be arrested for and charged with a criminal offence for doing? Just because somebody says they feel harassed by you doesn't mean you've committed a criminal offence and doesn't mean you've harassed them in law. The definition is very specific and it can be found at sections 1 and 1A of the Protection from Harassment Act 1997. The Protection from Harassment Act says, "A person must not pursue a course of conduct which amounts to harassment of another and which he knows or ought to know amounts to harassment of the other." It goes on to say at section 1A, "A person must not pursue a course of conduct which involves harassment of two or more persons and which he knows or ought to know involves harassment of those persons, and by which he intends to persuade any person not to do something that he is entitled or required to do, or to do something that he's not under any obligation to do." Right, so that's all a bit headache-inducing, so let's try to break that down into its constituent parts. First of all, harassment has to be a course of conduct. Now that means not one episode of harassment, but at least two. There've got to be at least two things that amount to harassment for it to become a course of conduct rather than an episode of conduct. So a single episode of harassment, no matter how bad, can't without more amount to a criminal offence. Of course, with more, for example, with threats of physical violence or indeed actual physical violence, it can be a separate criminal offence, but it won't be the offence of harassment. Now, just because two or more things have happened doesn't mean it's part of a course of conduct. The prosecution has to prove they're connected in some way. So how closely related were they in time? Are they part of a series of actions designed to achieve a particular aim on the part of the harasser or calculated to change the behaviour of the person being harassed? The court will look at how closely connected they all are to decide whether it amounts to a course of conduct. Conduct can mean pretty much anything. It can mean words, actions, texts, emails, WhatsApp messages. It's a very, very wide word. So if I kept phoning you in the middle of the night, that's much more likely because of the proximity in time to amount to a course of conduct than if I phoned you once every 3 months over the course of a couple of years. That would be unlikely to amount to a course of conduct because it doesn't have sufficient regularity about it. The behaviour has to amount to the harassment of another. Just because somebody feels harassed doesn't necessarily mean it will amount to the harassment of another. A magistrate or a judge will decide whether it is sufficiently serious to amount to harassment, and they look at the way that a reasonable person would view the situation. Just because you didn't intend it to amount to harassment doesn't mean that it's not at law harassment. Just because the recipient perceived it as harassment doesn't mean that it is in fact harassment. What a magistrate will do is look at what a reasonable person, which in the real world means what the magistrate thinks. They'll look at what a reasonable person thinks. Would a reasonable person think that the course of conduct you embarked on amounts to harassment? And if so, you're potentially guilty of the offence if the other elements are made out. And likewise with the requirement that the perpetrator, the person charged with the offence, has to know or ought to know that their behaviour amounts to harassment. So the mere fact you didn't think it amount to harassment isn't going to be a defence if a magistrate thinks you ought to have known it amounted to harassment. Again, a magistrate will look at the point of view of a reasonable person on the street. Would the reasonable, objective person thinks that what you're doing amounts to harassment? And if the answer to that is yes, then that element of the criminal offence is ticked off. Harassment can usually only be tried in a magistrate's court, and it carries a maximum sentence of an unlimited fine or 6 months imprisonment. That's harassment. Stalking is something slightly different, slightly more serious. It's essentially the offence of harassment, but with the stalking bit added to it. The Protection from Harassment Act 1997, Section 2A, says a person is guilty of an offence if the person pursues a course of conduct in breach of Section 1.1, that's harassment, and the course of conduct amounts to stalking. Now, the word stalking brings to mind images of following somebody around, smoking a cigarette, standing outside their house and looking up at their backlit window, but it can actually cover things that are a lot wider than that. As well as following someone around, as well as phoning somebody up, it can also cover following them around on social media. It can cover posting things in their name, pretending to be them. It can be posting things about them. It can be sending them tweets and texts and messages. So the word stalking can cover a huge variety of behaviour. It's not just what you imagine to be stalking from 1950s B-roll movies. Stalking can only be tried in a magistrate's court, and again, it carries an unlimited fine as a maximum, or a maximum of 6 months in prison. If you found this explainer guide useful, thank you so much for watching. Please do click the subscribe button below. I'm providing a series of explainer guides in all different areas of law, employment, crime, family, consumer. I'm building them up on this YouTube channel over the coming months. If you subscribe, if you click the notification bell, you'll hear about when you want to post it up. Thank you so much for watching. I'm Barrister Daniel Barnett. Bye-bye.